Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Curtain. Jonathan Hampton stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the Potomac River flow beneath the early morning mist. At 45, he had built an empire that few could comprehend. To the public, he was the CEO of Hampton Strategic Consulting, a firm that advised Fortune 500 companies on crisis management. To those who mattered in Washington, he was something far more valuable, the man who knew where every skeleton was buried. His journey to power hadn't been conventional. Born to a single mother in rural Virginia, Jonathan had clawed his way through Georgetown law on scholarships and sheer determination. His first job at the Pentagon as a junior analyst had opened doors most never knew existed. While others focused on climbing corporate ladders, Jonathan mapped the invisible networks that really controlled America. He cultivated relationships with senators' chiefs of staff, befriended the right people in intelligence agencies, and slowly built a web of influence that stretched from Capitol Hill to Langley. The irony wasn't lost on him that his success had attracted Carolina Miranda, a stunning political science professor at Georgetown. When they met at a diplomatic function 8 years ago, her beauty had captivated him, but it was her sharp intellect and ambition that sealed his interest. Carolina came from old money. Her father, Ambassador Ricardo Miranda, had served in 3 administrations. She understood power, or so Jonathan had thought. Their marriage had been a merger of sorts. Carolina brought social connections and legitimacy to Jonathan's wealth, while he provided her the resources to pursue her own ambitions. She transitioned from academia to consulting, eventually landing a position with the State Department's Foreign Policy Advisory Board. But lately, something had shifted. Jonathan's instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, sensed danger in his own home. Carolina had become distant, taking mysterious phone calls and making unexplained trips. Her laptop, once carelessly left open, was now password protected. Most tellingly, she'd started asking subtle questions about his work, questions that went beyond spousal curiosity. Jonathan's phone buzzed. Vincent Benjamin, his head of security and former Delta Force operator, appeared on the caller ID. "Sir, we've completed the surveillance sweep you requested. You need to see this immediately. My office. 10 minutes. Vincent arrived with a tablet containing weeks of compiled intelligence. The photographs made Jonathan's blood run cold. Carolina entering a hotel with Colonel Eric Lester from the Pentagon's Strategic Operations Division. The same hotel, multiple times, over 3 months. But the audio recordings were what transformed Jonathan's suspicion into cold, calculated fury. Jonathan suspects nothing. Carolina's voice was crystal clear through the recording device Vincent had planted in her car. He's so focused on his precious clients that he doesn't see what's happening right under his nose. Eric's voice responded, "The plan is solid, Carolina. My contacts in military intelligence are ready to move. Once we have concrete evidence of his illegal surveillance operations, we can bring him down. You'll get everything in the divorce, and I'll get the promotion I've been promised for exposing a national security threat." Jonathan set the tablet down carefully, his expression never changing. Vincent had worked with him long enough to recognize the deadly calm that preceded Jonathan's most ruthless decisions. "How long have you known?" Vincent asked. "I suspected for weeks." "You've confirmed it." Jonathan walked to his safe, retrieving a file that few people knew existed. "Carolina thinks she's hunting a wolf. She's about to learn she's been living with a dragon." The file contained information that could topple governments. Recordings of senators discussing illegal campaign contributions, photographs of federal judges in compromising positions, evidence of CIA operations that violated international law. This wasn't just leverage, it was nuclear-grade political ammunition. "What's the play, boss?" Vincent asked. Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let them think they're winning. Eric Lester wants to play with the big boys. Let's see how he handles the real game." Chapter 2. The Colonel's Gambit. Colonel Eric Lester sat in his Pentagon office, reviewing the fabricated intelligence reports that would soon destroy Jonathan Hampton. At 38, Eric had spent 15 years building his military career with one goal: achieving the star of a general before 40. The problem was that legitimate advancement took too long, and Eric's patience had run out. His relationship with Carolina had started innocently enough. They'd met at a Defense Department reception where she was consulting on a foreign policy initiative. Eric had been immediately drawn to her sophistication and insider knowledge of Washington's power structures. When he learned she was married to Jonathan Hampton, his interest became strategic. Eric had heard whispers about Hampton's real business for years. Intelligence officers talked in hushed tones about the consultant who somehow knew classified information before it was classified. Some called him a patriot who helped prevent security breaches. Others labeled him a dangerous information broker who operated outside legal boundaries. Carolina had been surprisingly receptive to his advances. During their affair, she'd revealed intimate details about Jonathan's operations, his network of informants, his methods for gathering intelligence, and most importantly, his weaknesses. Eric realized he'd found his ticket to the general's star he coveted. "The evidence is compelling, sir," Eric told Brigadier General Raymond Singleton during their weekly briefing. "Hampton's company has been conducting illegal surveillance operations against federal officials. We have testimony from his wife confirming his activities." General Singleton, a by-the-book officer who'd risen through legitimate channels, frowned at the report. "This is serious, Colonel. If Hampton is truly compromising national security, we need to act decisively. I recommend we coordinate with military police for immediate detention," Eric suggested. "Given the sensitivity, we should handle this internally before involving civilian authorities." What Eric didn't know was that General Singleton had served with Vincent Benjamin in Iraq. A casual mention of Hampton's name had prompted Singleton to make a discreet phone call. The general now knew exactly who Eric Lester really was, and who he was truly working against. Meanwhile, Carolina was playing her own dangerous game. In her Georgetown townhouse, she met with Wendell Jacobs, an ambitious defense contractor who'd promised her wealth beyond imagination once Jonathan was eliminated as a competitor. "Eric is moving tomorrow," Carolina told Jacobs. "The military police will arrest Jonathan on treason charges. Once he's detained, I'll have access to his files. We can expose his entire network and claim we were working undercover to stop him." Jacobs smiled. "And I'll be perfectly positioned to acquire his most valuable contracts. Your husband built quite an empire, Carolina. Shame he won't be around to enjoy it." What neither Carolina nor Jacobs realized was that Jonathan had been feeding them information for weeks. Every document they thought they'd stolen, every recording they believed was evidence of his crimes, had been carefully crafted to lead them exactly where Jonathan wanted them to go. In a secure facility outside Washington, Jonathan's real files remained untouched. His actual network of informants continued their work, unaware that their identities had never been compromised. Most importantly, his most dangerous secrets, the kind that could topple governments, remained safely hidden. As Carolina celebrated what she believed was her husband's impending downfall, Jonathan was 3 moves ahead, orchestrating a game of chess where his opponents didn't even realize they were pawns. Chapter 3: The Web Titans. The morning of what Carolina believed would be Jonathan's arrest began like any other. Jonathan kissed her goodbye at their Potomac mansion, his demeanor giving no hint of the storm about to break. He'd studied his wife's betrayal like a military campaign, mapping every alliance and weakness until he understood the full scope of her treachery. The revelation that had hurt most wasn't the affair. Jonathan's emotional investment in their marriage had died months ago. It was the discovery that Carolina had been feeding information to Wendell Jacobs for over a year, information that had cost Jonathan 3 major contracts and nearly exposed 2 of his most valuable sources. Her betrayal wasn't just personal. It was potentially catastrophic to people who trusted him with their lives. At Hampton Strategic Consulting, Jonathan convened an emergency meeting with his inner circle. Besides Vincent Benjamin, the group included Trudy Hill, his chief financial officer and former NSA analyst, and Philip Brewer, his legal counsel who'd previously served as a federal prosecutor. "Today's the day they make their move," Jonathan announced. Eric has convinced his superiors to authorize my arrest. Carolina believes she'll inherit my empire. Jacobs thinks he'll acquire my government contracts. Trudy pulled up financial records on her laptop. We've traced the money trail. Jacobs has been funneling payments to Eric through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The affair was purely transactional. Carolina gets half your assets in the divorce. Eric gets his general star for exposing you, and Jacobs eliminates his biggest competitor. Philip reviewed legal documents. The treason charges are based on fabricated evidence, but they'll hold long enough to freeze your assets and destroy your reputation. In the short term, they'll achieve their goals. Jonathan walked to a wall-mounted screen displaying a complex organizational chart. They've made one critical error. They assumed I've been operating illegally all these years. He touched the screen, revealing a second layer of information. Every source, every operation, every piece of intelligence I've gathered has been conducted under proper legal authority. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Vincent was the first to understand. You're not just a consultant. You've been working directly for. The Deputy Director of National Intelligence has been my handler for 8 years, Jonathan confirmed. Every foreign contact I've cultivated, every piece of classified information I've accessed, every operation I've conducted has been sanctioned at the highest levels. My criminal enterprise is actually one of the government's most successful human intelligence operations. Trudy whistled softly. So, when they arrest you for treason, they'll be arresting a decorated intelligence asset, Philip finished. The political fallout will be spectacular. Jonathan's phone rang. The caller ID showed a Pentagon number. Mr. Hampton, this is Master Sergeant Chuck Brooks with the 519th Military Police Battalion. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of treason against the United States. Please report to our facility immediately for processing. I'll be there within the hour, Sergeant, Jonathan replied calmly. After ending the call, he turned to his team. Phase 1 begins now. Trudy, initiate the Prometheus Protocol. Philip, prepare the legal counterstrike. Vincent, you know what to do. As Jonathan prepared for his arrest, Carolina was already celebrating at the Four Seasons with Eric and Jacobs. She'd filed divorce papers that morning, confident that her husband would soon be too disgraced to fight her in court. To new beginnings, Jacobs toasted, raising his champagne glass. To justice, Eric added, checking his phone for updates on Jonathan's arrest. Carolina smiled, imagining the look on Jonathan's face when the handcuffs clicked into place. She had no idea that her husband had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, or that her celebration was about to become a funeral for her own ambitions. At 3:47 p.m., as military police escorted Jonathan Hampton into their facility, the most elaborate revenge in Washington's history began to unfold. Chapter 4. The phone call that changed everything. The military police station buzzed with nervous energy as news of Jonathan Hampton's arrest spread through the Pentagon. Colonel Eric Lester paced in his office, waiting for confirmation that his plan had succeeded. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, the operation that would secure his promotion and eliminate the man who'd unknowingly stood in his way for years. In the interrogation room, Jonathan sat calmly across from Master Sergeant Chuck Brooks and Captain Angel Bautista, the investigating officers assigned to his case. His composure unnerved them. Most people facing treason charges showed at least some anxiety. Mr. Hampton, Captain Bautista began, your wife has provided testimony alleging that you've been conducting illegal surveillance operations against federal officials. She claims to have evidence of your activities. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. Carolina has indeed been very thorough in her documentation. Tell me, Captain, has Colonel Lester briefed you on the full scope of these allegations? The officers exchanged glances. Sergeant Brooks consulted his notes. Colonel Lester provided the initial intelligence that led to this investigation. Are you claiming his information is inaccurate? Not inaccurate, Jonathan replied. Incomplete. Very incomplete. He leaned back in his chair. I'd like to make my phone call now. Captain Bautista gestured toward the phone on the wall. You're entitled to contact an attorney. Who are you calling? Jonathan's answer made both officers freeze. The White House. Sergeant Brooks laughed nervously. Sir, this isn't a movie. You can't just call the White House. Jonathan calmly dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a professional voice answered. White House Situation Room. This is Barry Howell. Barry, this is Jonathan Hampton. Authorization code Raven 77 Echo. I need to speak with Deputy Chief of Staff Cassandra Livingston immediately. Jonathan? Jesus, what's your situation? I'm currently detained by military police on fabricated treason charges. Someone's been feeding them disinformation about my operations. Stand by. The line went quiet for 30 seconds while the officers stared at Jonathan in growing disbelief. When the voice returned, it carried the unmistakable authority of the executive office. Jonathan, this is Cassandra. We're tracking your situation in real time. Are you injured? Negative, but we have a significant security breach. The operation has been compromised by hostile actors within the Pentagon and civilian sectors. Understood. Executive protection protocols are now in effect. Expect immediate intervention. Jonathan hung up and turned to the stunned officers. Gentlemen, you might want to call your commanding officer. This situation is about to escalate rapidly. Less than an hour later, Leonard Adams, the Deputy Chief of Staff, arrived at the military police facility accompanied by 2 Secret Service agents and a Deputy Attorney General. Behind him walked General Raymond Singleton, whose expression made it clear that someone was about to face severe consequences. Release Mr. Hampton immediately, Adams ordered. This detention is unauthorized and potentially compromises ongoing national security operations. Captain Bautista stammered, Sir, we have orders from Colonel Lester based on intelligence from. Colonel Lester, General Singleton interrupted, has been relieved of duty pending investigation for abuse of authority and possible treason. Where is he now? While chaos erupted at the military police facility, Carolina received a panic call from Eric. They're not just releasing him. Eric's voice shook with fear. The White House intervened directly. Carolina, what the hell have we done? That's impossible, Carolina protested, but doubt was already creeping into her voice. Jonathan is just a consultant. He doesn't have those kinds of connections. The Deputy Chief of Staff is here personally. They're talking about charging me with treason. Carolina, I think we've made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, Wendell Jacobs was discovering that his triumph had turned to disaster. Federal agents had simultaneously raided his offices and frozen his assets. The shell company he'd used to pay Eric had been under surveillance for months, and every financial transaction was now evidence in a federal conspiracy case. As Jonathan walked out of the military police facility as a free man, he placed a call to Vincent Benjamin. Phase 2 is a go, he said simply. The trap hadn't just been sprung. It had been perfectly executed. Carolina, Eric, and Jacobs had revealed the full extent of their conspiracy, provided evidence of their crimes, and eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. But Jonathan's revenge was just beginning. Chapter 5, The Unraveling. The Georgetown townhouse that Carolina Miranda Hampton had inherited from her father felt like a prison as she paced frantically through its elegant rooms. 24 hours after Jonathan's release, her world was collapsing with terrifying speed. The divorce papers she'd filed so confidently were now meaningless. Federal authorities had frozen all marital assets, pending investigation of her involvement in what they were calling a complex conspiracy against national security. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and former friends distancing themselves from the growing scandal. The most devastating call came from her father's former colleague, Ambassador Fernando McNeil. Carolina, your father is rolling in his grave. McNeil's voice was cold with disgust. The Miranda name stood for honor and service to this country for 3 generations. What you've done, it's unconscionable. I didn't know, Carolina protested weakly. Jonathan never told me he was working for the government. Of course he didn't. That's what classified means, you foolish girl. Did you really think a man with his connections was operating outside the law? The truth was, Carolina had never bothered to consider the full implications of her husband's power. She'd been so focused on what she saw as his vulnerabilities that she'd missed the obvious signs of his true authority. The late-night calls from unnamed officials, the deference shown to him by people who typically defer to no one, the way investigations that might have touched his business mysteriously redirected elsewhere. It all made terrible sense now. At the Federal Detention Center, Eric Lester sat in his cell, contemplating the destruction of everything he'd worked to achieve. His military career was over, his pension gone, and criminal charges were being prepared that could result in life in prison. The general star he'd coveted so desperately now seemed like a cruel joke. His cellmate, a drug dealer named Calvin Hancock, found Eric's situation amusing. "Man, you really thought you could take down someone connected to the White House? That's some serious stupid right there." Eric's lawyer, a public defender named Marcia Groves, had delivered even worse news during their meeting. "The government has recordings of every conversation you had with Mrs. Hampton and Mr. Jacobs. They know about the Swiss bank account, the Cayman Islands shell company, even the vacation you took to Dubai last month. They've been watching this conspiracy unfold from the beginning." "That's impossible," Eric insisted. "We were careful. Mr. Lester, they were feeding you information. Every document you thought you'd stolen, every piece of evidence you believed exposed Mr. Hampton's illegal activities. It was all fabricated and provided to you deliberately. You weren't investigating a criminal. You were being manipulated by a master strategist." The revelation that Jonathan had orchestrated every aspect of their conspiracy sent Eric into a despair deeper than anything he'd experienced in combat. He'd been a decorated officer, a leader of men, a professional soldier, and he'd been played like an amateur by a civilian consultant. Meanwhile, Wendell Jacobs was learning that his corporate empire had been built on foundations of sand. Federal auditors had descended on his company like locusts, and they were discovering that many of his most profitable government contracts had been obtained through the very information Carolina had stolen from Jonathan. The fraud charges alone could result in decades in prison, but the national security implications meant he was looking at potential life sentences. His wife, Shannon Gilmore Jacobs, had already filed for divorce and moved their children to her parents' home in California. His business partners were turning state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. His lawyers were suggesting plea bargains that would still leave him imprisoned until his 70s. From his penthouse office, Jonathan watched the destruction he'd orchestrated with the same calm efficiency he'd applied to its planning. Vincent Benjamin brought him regular updates on the investigation's progress. "Eric's military tribunal is scheduled for next month," Vincent reported. "He's looking at charges of conspiracy, treason, theft of classified information, and financial crimes. His lawyer's trying to negotiate a plea, but the military prosecutors aren't interested. And Jacobs, federal prosecutors are considering him a flight risk. His passport's been revoked, and there's talk of moving him to a maximum security facility. The Financial Crimes Unit says they've never seen a conspiracy this extensive involving defense contracts." Jonathan nodded. "What about Carolina?" "That's where it gets interesting," Vincent smiled grimly. "She's not just facing charges related to the conspiracy. The Justice Department has been investigating her consulting work, and they've discovered she's been selling classified information to foreign contacts for over 2 years. Information she accessed through your security clearance." The final betrayal was worse than Jonathan had imagined. Carolina hadn't just been unfaithful and greedy. She'd been a traitor, using their marriage to compromise national security for personal profit. The woman he'd loved had been systematically destroying everything he'd built while selling out her own country. Jonathan walked to his window, watching the Potomac flow beneath the setting sun. The first phase of his revenge was complete. His enemies were exposed, arrested, and facing the full weight of the federal justice system. But true retribution required more than legal consequences. It required personal destruction. Chapter 6: The Point of No Return. The secure conference room in the federal building hummed with tension as U.S. Attorney Olivia Solomon outlined the government's case against the conspiracy. Present were representatives from the Justice Department, Pentagon, National Security Agency, and Jonathan Hampton himself, now officially acknowledged as a deep-cover intelligence asset. The scope of this betrayal is unprecedented, Solomon announced, gesturing to charts covering the walls. Mrs. Hampton didn't just compromise her husband's operations. She sold classified intelligence to representatives of 3 hostile foreign governments. Colonel Lester wasn't just committing financial crimes. He was systematically exposing military personnel in classified positions. Mr. Jacobs wasn't just engaging in contract fraud. He was using stolen intelligence to underbid legitimate defense contractors by billions of dollars. Jonathan studied the evidence with professional detachment. Audio recordings of Carolina meeting with Chinese intelligence operatives. Financial records showing Eric had been feeding information to Russian contacts for 18 months. Documentation proving Jacobs had been selling classified defense technologies to Iranian proxies through shell companies. The betrayal was more comprehensive than even Jonathan had suspected. His wife hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd been a full-scale foreign asset using their marriage as cover for espionage. Eric wasn't just a corrupt officer seeking advancement. He was a traitor who'd compromised dozens of undercover operatives. Jacobs wasn't merely a greedy businessman. He was facilitating the transfer of military secrets to America's enemies. Mr. Hampton, Solomon continued, given the classified nature of your work, we can't try this case in open court. However, we can ensure that justice is served through military tribunals and federal security courts. Jonathan nodded slowly. I appreciate the government's position, but I have a different concern. These individuals didn't just commit crimes against the state, they violated personal trust in ways that demand personal consequences. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood that Jonathan Hampton wasn't just a betrayed husband or a compromised intelligence asset. He was a man with the connections and resources to ensure that justice extended far beyond what any court could provide. Deputy Attorney General Andre Petty leaned forward. Mr. Hampton, while we understand your personal investment in this case, we can't sanction any extrajudicial activities. Of course not, Jonathan replied with a slight smile. I wouldn't dream of asking for official sanction. After the meeting, Jonathan drove to the maximum security facility where Carolina was being held pending trial. The woman who greeted him in the visitor's room bore little resemblance to the sophisticated beauty he'd married. Her designer clothes had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Her perfectly styled hair hung limp around her face, and her eyes showed the haunted look of someone whose world had completely collapsed. Hello, Carolina, Jonathan said calmly, sitting across from her at the metal table. Jonathan, she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. I didn't know they would. Stop. His voice was quiet but carried such authority that Carolina immediately fell silent. Don't insult my intelligence with lies. I know about Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. I know about the Swiss accounts and the numbered companies. I know you've been a foreign asset since before we married. Carolina's face went white. The scope of her exposure was clearly worse than she'd imagined. I came here to tell you something important, Jonathan continued. The federal prosecutors think life in prison is sufficient punishment for treason. They're wrong. What do you mean? Carolina's voice shook. Jonathan leaned closer, his eyes showing no trace of the man who'd once professed to love her. You sold classified information that got people killed, Carolina. Agents in the field, assets we'd cultivated for years, operatives with families who trusted that their identities were secure. You murdered them for money. I never meant for anyone to. You don't get to claim good intentions when you're counting blood money, Jonathan interrupted. The courts will give you a cage for the rest of your life. I'm going to give you something worse. Carolina stared at him in growing terror. What are you going to do? Jonathan stood to leave. I'm going to make sure that every person who dies because of your betrayal has a family member who knows exactly who you are and what you did. Every widow, every orphan child, every parent who lost a son or daughter because of your greed. They'll know your name, your face, and exactly how to find you. You can't do that, Carolina protested desperately. I'll be in protective custody. Prison has its own justice system, Carolina, and money talks in every language. Jonathan's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. You wanted to destroy my life for profit. Now you'll spend what's left of yours looking over your shoulder, wondering which guard has been paid to look the other way, which inmate has a dead relative to avenge, which meal might be your last. As Jonathan walked away, Carolina's screams echoed through the visitor's room. For the first time since her arrest, she truly understood the scope of what she'd unleashed. She'd betrayed a man who didn't just have power. She betrayed a man who understood how to use it without limits or mercy. The game was no longer about legal justice. It was about survival, and Carolina was beginning to realize she was about to lose that too. Chapter 7. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. 6 months after the arrests, the federal trials had concluded with devastating efficiency. Eric Lester had been sentenced to life in military prison without possibility of parole after a tribunal convicted him of treason, espionage, and conspiracy. Wendell Jacobs received concurrent life sentences in federal court for his role in selling defense secrets to foreign governments. Carolina faced the same fate, with her trial scheduled for the following month. But Jonathan Hampton's revenge was far from complete. From his rebuilt offices, the investigation had cleared him of all wrongdoing and restored his security clearances. Jonathan orchestrated a campaign of systematic destruction that reached far beyond simple legal consequences. His targets had taken everything from him: his trust, his marriage, his security, and most importantly, they'd gotten intelligence operatives killed. The courts could imprison them, but only Jonathan could ensure they truly paid for their crimes. Vincent Benjamin entered Jonathan's office with a tablet containing surveillance reports. Carolina's been moved to administrative segregation after the third incident. Someone got to her in the shower block last week. Anyone seriously hurt? Jonathan asked without looking up from his work. Minor injuries, mostly psychological damage. But word is spreading through the prison population about what she did. Turns out 2 of the women in her block lost brothers in Afghanistan. Operations that were compromised by intelligence she sold. Jonathan nodded. He'd quietly ensured that information about Carolina's betrayals reached the right ears within the federal prison system. Not through direct action, that would have been too traceable, but through careful manipulation of information networks that already existed. A leaked document here, a whispered conversation there, and suddenly Carolina's fellow inmates understood exactly why their sons and husbands had died in operations that should have been secure. What about Jacobs? Jonathan asked. Federal prison is harder to penetrate, but we've made progress. His former business partners have been sharing information about his activities with other inmates. Turns out defense contractors aren't popular with military veterans serving time for unrelated offenses. Wendell Jacobs was discovering that federal prison contained its own justice system. Men who'd lost friends to improvised explosive devices didn't take kindly to contractors who'd sold the technology to make those devices more effective. Guards who were military veterans themselves found it difficult to maintain professional protection for someone who betrayed their brothers in arms. But Eric Lester was experiencing the most comprehensive destruction. Military prisons operated by different rules, and Eric had violated the most sacred trust in the armed forces. His fellow inmates were all military personnel who'd committed various offenses, but treason was in a category by itself. The psychological warfare was methodical and relentless. Eric's cell was searched daily for security reasons, interrupting his sleep and preventing any sense of routine. His mail was delayed or lost by postal clerks who happened to be veterans of units he'd compromised. During exercise periods, other inmates would accidentally bump into him, whisper the names of dead operatives in his ear, or simply stare at him with undisguised hatred. Most devastating were the photographs that somehow found their way to him. Pictures of military funerals, of flag-draped coffins, of widows receiving folded flags from honor guards. Each photograph bore a simple note: "You did this." The psychological pressure was breaking him systematically. Eric had been a strong man, a decorated officer accustomed to stress and danger. But this wasn't combat. This was slow, methodical, psychological torture designed to destroy his sanity one piece at a time. Meanwhile, Jonathan was expanding his campaign beyond the primary conspirators. Every person who'd known about the plot and failed to stop it every official who'd been compromised by the stolen intelligence, every business partner who'd benefited from Jacobs's illegal activities. All of them found their lives touched by consequences that seemed random, but were actually precisely orchestrated. Senator William Curtis, who'd been receiving classified briefings from Carolina in exchange for favorable committee votes, suddenly found himself under ethics investigation. The evidence had appeared anonymously in the hands of investigative journalists, but the documentation was too detailed and accurate to ignore. Admiral Benjamin Allison, who'd been Eric's contact in naval intelligence, discovered that his involvement had been reported to the Pentagon Inspector General. His security clearance was suspended pending investigation, effectively ending his career 6 months before retirement. Defense contractor Aurora Hodge, who'd been laundering payments from Jacobs to various officials, learned that the IRS had received detailed financial records showing her participation in tax evasion schemes. Federal agents raided her home and offices simultaneously, seizing everything she'd built over 20 years in business. The pattern was clear to anyone looking carefully. Everyone who'd touched the conspiracy was being systematically destroyed. But the evidence of their destruction appeared to come through normal investigative channels, making it impossible to prove that Jonathan Hampton was orchestrating their downfall. From his office, Jonathan watched the news coverage of Senator Curtis's resignation with satisfaction. The reporter was discussing how new evidence had revealed a pattern of corruption that investigators were still unraveling. What the reporter didn't know was that Jonathan had spent years documenting every instance of corruption he'd encountered, building files that could destroy careers and lives with surgical precision. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Philip Brewer, his legal counsel. "Jonathan, we need to talk. The Justice Department wants to offer Carolina a plea bargain." "Declined." Jonathan responded immediately. "You haven't heard the terms yet." "I don't care about the terms, Philip. Carolina dies in prison, or she dies somewhere else. Those are the only 2 options." Philip was quiet for a moment. "Jonathan, I understand your anger, but—" "No, you don't," Jonathan interrupted. "You understand legal consequences. You understand justice as defined by courts and laws. What you don't understand is that some betrayals demand permanent consequences." After ending the call, Jonathan returned to his work. 3 more congressional staffers would find their careers destroyed by anonymous tips about their involvement in the conspiracy. 2 federal judges who'd been receiving classified information from Carolina would face impeachment proceedings. A dozen business executives who'd benefited from Jacobs's stolen intelligence would discover that their companies were now under federal investigation. The web of destruction was expanding methodically, touching everyone who'd participated in or profited from the betrayal of American intelligence operations. Jonathan's revenge wasn't just personal. It was institutional, designed to send a message that some lines could never be crossed without facing consequences that extended far beyond any courtroom. But the most important message was personal. Carolina, Eric, and Jacobs had believed they could destroy Jonathan Hampton and walk away with their profits and promotions. They were about to learn that some men, when betrayed completely, respond with a ruthlessness that makes survival impossible. Chapter 8. No Mercy for the Wicked. The letter arrived at Carolina's federal prison cell on a Tuesday morning, delivered through official channels, but carrying an unofficial message that made her blood run cold. It contained a single photograph, her sister Antoinette Christensen being escorted from her Georgetown law office by federal agents. The accompanying news clipping explained that Antoinette was under investigation for money laundering related to the foreign intelligence payments Carolina had received. Carolina stared at the image with growing horror. Antoinette was innocent. She'd never been involved in any of Carolina's activities. But the evidence appeared devastating. Financial records showing regular payments from Antoinette's law firm to accounts Carolina had used for her espionage activities. Of course, those records were fabricated, but they would be impossible to disprove given the complexity of international financial transactions. A guard appeared at her cell door. "Hampton, you have a visitor." In the visiting room, Carolina found herself face-to-face with her sister for the first time since the arrests. Antoinette looked exhausted and terrified, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by the haggard look of someone whose life was collapsing. "Carolina, what have you done?" Antoinette's voice shook with barely controlled emotion. "They're saying I helped you launder money from foreign governments. They're threatening to seize my law practice, my home, everything I've worked for. I never involved you in anything," Carolina protested. "You have to believe me, Antoinette. I kept my activities completely separate from family." "Then explain how my client accounts show payments to your offshore companies," Antoinette demanded, producing documents that Carolina recognized as genuine but impossible. "Explain how my law firm's computers contain encrypted communications with your foreign contacts." Carolina stared at the evidence with growing realization. Jonathan hadn't just destroyed her. He was systematically destroying everyone she cared about. The evidence against Antoinette was fabricated but sophisticated enough to withstand legal scrutiny. Her sister would spend years fighting charges that would bankrupt her even if she ultimately won. "He's doing this," Carolina whispered. "Jonathan is destroying you to hurt me." "Who is Jonathan Hampton?" Antoinette asked desperately. "Why would he do this to our family?" Carolina looked at her sister, brilliant, honest, dedicated to justice and law, and realized she could never explain the true scope of what she'd unleashed. How could she tell Antoinette that she'd betrayed her country for money? How could she explain that her greed had gotten intelligence operatives killed? How could she admit that her husband wasn't just a businessman, but a man with the power to destroy lives with surgical precision? "Stay away from me," Carolina said finally. "Don't visit, don't call, don't try to help me. Maybe if you distance yourself completely, he'll leave you alone." But even as she said it, Carolina knew it was too late. Jonathan's revenge was comprehensive and unforgiving. Anyone who'd benefited from her life, anyone who loved her, anyone who might provide her comfort in prison, they would all be systematically destroyed until she had nothing left but the horror of what she'd done. At the military prison, Eric Lester was experiencing his own family tragedy. His ex-wife Patricia Wilson had remarried and changed her name, hoping to escape the stigma of her association with a convicted traitor. But somehow, her new employer had discovered her connection to Eric. The private security firm where she worked required federal clearances, and employees with family ties to foreign intelligence assets were considered security risks. Patricia's termination had been swift and devastating. In the competitive world of security contracting, her association with Eric made her unemployable. She'd moved 3 times in 6 months, trying to find work under her maiden name, but the information always surfaced. Her new husband, a good man who'd married her despite her past, was beginning to strain under the financial and social pressure. Their children, Eric's stepchildren whom he'd helped raise, were suffering most of all. Classmates had discovered their family connection to the traitor colonel through internet searches and social media. They faced daily harassment at school, with teachers struggling to address bullying based on family connections to national security crimes. Eric received letters from Patricia begging him to somehow make the persecution stop. She didn't understand that her ex-husband was as powerless as she was against the systematic destruction being orchestrated against anyone connected to the conspiracy. Jonathan Hampton's revenge extended beyond the primary targets to encompass everyone who might provide them comfort or support. Meanwhile, Wendell Jacobs was learning that his children faced their own consequences. His son Juan Franklin Jacobs had been expelled from West Point when investigators discovered that his father had used stolen military intelligence to fund the boy's education. The honor code violations were clear. One had benefited from treasonous activities, making him unfit for military service. His daughter Lorna Houston Jacobs, a medical student at Johns Hopkins, found herself under investigation by the state medical board. Questions have been raised about whether her education had been funded through illegal activities, potentially disqualifying her from obtaining a medical license. The investigation would take years to resolve, effectively ending her medical career before it began. From his office, Jonathan reviewed updates on each family's destruction with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to protecting national security. The children were collateral damage, but necessary collateral damage. The message had to be absolute. Betraying Jonathan Hampton didn't just destroy the betrayer. It destroyed everyone they loved. Vincent Benjamin expressed concern about the scope of the campaign. "Sir, some of these people are genuinely innocent. The children had no knowledge of their parents' activities." Jonathan looked up from his files. "Vincent, how many children lost parents because of the intelligence Carolina sold? How many families were destroyed when Eric compromised undercover operations? How many wives became widows because Jacobs gave our enemies the technology to kill American soldiers more efficiently?" "Point taken, sir. Betrayal has consequences," Jonathan continued. "Not just for the betrayer, but for everyone connected to them. That's how trust works in our world. When you violate it, the penalty extends beyond just yourself." The phone rang with an update from his congressional sources. 3 more officials connected to the conspiracy had announced their resignations under pressure from ethics investigations. 2 federal judges were facing impeachment proceedings. A dozen defense contractors had lost their security clearances and government contracts. But the most important call came from the prison system itself. Carolina had been moved to solitary confinement after attempting suicide. Eric was under psychiatric observation after a complete mental breakdown. Jacobs had been hospitalized following a severe beating by fellow inmates who'd learned about his role in selling military secrets. "Sir," the caller reported, "all 3 primary targets are broken, psychologically, physically, and financially destroyed. Their families are scattered and ruined. Everyone connected to the conspiracy has faced consequences. The message has been delivered." Jonathan hung up and walked to his window, watching the Potomac flow beneath the evening sky. Phase 3 of his revenge was complete. His enemies weren't just imprisoned. They were destroyed so thoroughly that their very existence served as a warning to others who might consider betraying him. But one final phase remained. The phase that would ensure this betrayal could never happen again. Chapter 9. The Dragon's Final Lesson. 1 year after the conspiracy's exposure, Jonathan Hampton stood in the Oval Office receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his extraordinary service to national security under circumstances that required personal sacrifice and exceptional courage. The president, flanked by the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense, spoke about Jonathan's contributions to preventing one of the most serious intelligence breaches in American history. What the public didn't know was that Jonathan had helped expose the conspiracy by allowing it to develop far enough to identify every participant, every foreign contact, and every compromised operation. His apparent victimization had been a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation that had rolled up enemy networks across 3 continents. "Your willingness to endure personal betrayal for the sake of national security exemplifies the highest ideals of service," the president said as he placed the medal around Jonathan's neck. "The intelligence gathered through this operation has prevented multiple terrorist attacks and exposed foreign agents operating at the highest levels of our government." After the ceremony, Jonathan returned to his expanded headquarters. Hampton Strategic Consulting had grown exponentially following the publicity of his government service. Companies and individuals who'd previously been skeptical of his methods now competed for his attention. More importantly, his reputation as someone who never forgot a betrayal and never forgave an enemy had reached the right ears throughout Washington's power structure. His inner circle had evolved as well. Trudy Hill had been promoted to deputy director, effectively running daily operations while Jonathan focused on strategic planning. Philip Brewer had transitioned from legal counsel to chief operating officer, overseeing the company's expansion into new markets. Vincent Benjamin continued to serve as head of security, but now commanded a team of former military and intelligence operatives who handled Jonathan's most sensitive requirements. The final status reports on his enemies made for satisfying reading. Carolina had been found dead in her prison cell 3 months earlier, officially ruled a suicide, but understood by everyone involved to have been assisted by fellow inmates who'd lost family members to her betrayals. Her sister Antoinette had lost her law practice and declared bankruptcy fighting charges that were eventually dropped, but only after her career and reputation were completely destroyed. Eric Lester remained in military prison, but his mind had been broken by the systematic psychological pressure and the knowledge that his family continued to suffer consequences for his crimes. His ex-wife had divorced her second husband and moved to rural Montana with the children, tried to escape the stigma that followed them everywhere. Eric's son had joined the army under an assumed name, desperate to restore honor to a family name that had become synonymous with treason. Wendell Jacobs had died in federal prison after a beating that left him comatose for weeks before his life support was disconnected. His children had scattered across the country, changing their names and trying to build lives free from their father's legacy. His wife had committed suicide 6 months after his death, unable to cope with the financial ruin and social ostracism. But Jonathan's most important victory was institutional. The conspiracy's exposure had led to comprehensive reforms in military intelligence, new oversight procedures for defense contractors, and enhanced security protocols that made similar betrayals far more difficult. More personally, Jonathan's reputation had evolved from that of a successful consultant to something approaching legend, a man whose enemies simply disappeared, whose friends prospered beyond measure, and whose word carried the weight of presidential authority. Sitting in his office, Jonathan reviewed a proposal from the Central Intelligence Agency to formalize his role as a deep cover asset with expanded authority and resources. The offer was tempting. Official government backing would provide even greater protection and access. But Jonathan had learned that true power came from operating in the spaces between official channels, where accountability was limited and methods were unrestricted. His phone buzzed with a text from Shannon Gilmore, a junior senator from California who'd been helpful during the investigation. "Jonathan, I'm facing some opposition research that's gotten very personal. Would you be available for consultation?" Jonathan smiled as he typed his response. "Senator, I'll look into it immediately. Some problems require specialized solutions." This was how power really worked in Washington, not through official channels or public processes, but through quiet conversations and invisible interventions. Jonathan had built a network of people who owed him favors, feared his capabilities, or both. His enemies had learned that betraying him carried consequences that extended far beyond legal punishment, while his allies understood that his protection was absolute and his memory was long. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Vincent Benjamin entered with a tablet containing surveillance reports from around the world. "Sir, we've identified 3 more foreign intelligence operatives trying to penetrate defense contractors using similar methods to the Jacobs operation. Also, there are indications that Chinese intelligence is attempting to recruit the widow of one of our former assets." Jonathan nodded. "Recommendations? Eliminate the threat before it develops. We have the legal authority and the operational capability." "Approved. But Vincent, make sure the message is clear. Anyone who targets American intelligence operations or attempt to compromise our people will face consequences that make the Jacobs conspiracy look merciful." As Vincent left to coordinate the operation, Jonathan returned to his window overlooking the Potomac. The river flowed endlessly toward the Chesapeake Bay, carrying away the remnants of what it had seen while continuing its eternal journey. Like the river, Jonathan had adapted to the landscape around him, becoming a force of nature that reshaped everything it touched. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him had instead transformed him into something more dangerous and more powerful than his enemies had ever imagined. Carolina, Eric, and Jacobs had believed they were hunting a successful businessman. They discovered too late that they were actually prey, stalked by a predator whose patience was limitless and whose memory was perfect. In the end, they'd gotten exactly what they'd given: betrayal, suffering, and destruction. The only difference was that Jonathan's version was permanent, comprehensive, and served as a warning to anyone else who might consider crossing him. The dragon had taught his final lesson, and Washington had learned it well. Some men could be beaten, bought, or broken. Jonathan Hampton was not one of them. He was a force of nature, a consequence waiting to happen, a reminder that in the shadow world where power really lived, betrayal was the one sin that could never be forgiven or forgotten. The river continued to flow, carrying away the past while revealing the future. And in his office high above the water, Jonathan Hampton planned for a world where loyalty was rewarded absolutely and betrayal was punished without mercy or limit. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.